I remember the exact moment it all fell apart. We were at dinner with friends, one of those easy, wine-soaked evenings where the conversation flows effortlessly, and everyone feels just charming enough to believe they belong in a romantic comedy. The restaurant was cozy, the hum of conversations blending with the clink of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter. I was sitting across from my husband, watching him laugh at something our friend Sarah had said. His face lit up in that way it used to when we first met, like the weight of the world had momentarily slipped off his shoulders. I felt warm and light, like maybe everything was just fine. We were talking about work, as people inevitably do when they run out of more interesting things to say. Everyone was swapping stories, frustrating bosses, new clients, impossible deadlines. I was on my second glass of wine, just tipsy enough to feel clever but not sloppy. The question came up naturally, as questions in these circles often do. So how's work going for you guys? My husband's jaw tensed slightly. I saw it the way his shoulders pulled back, bracing himself. I knew he hated that question. His job was fine but not glamorous, and I knew he felt the weight of unspoken comparisons. People like Sarah, with her high-powered marketing career and endless anecdotes about jet-setting client meetings, always made him a little quieter. Before he could answer, I jumped in. I told myself I was saving him from the awkwardness, being the fun, breezy wife who could smooth over any social situation. Oh, I said, grinning, keeping us humble. Someone gotta do it, right? There was laughter, not mean-spirited, just the polite kind people offer at dinner parties when they're not quite sure if they're supposed to laugh or nod sympathetically. I felt the warm flush of validation, that hit of dopamine that comes from making people laugh. I looked at my husband, expecting him to join in, to roll his eyes and chuckle along with me, but he didn't. His face was stone cold, his eyes unreadable. The smile froze on my lips. The moment passed quickly, the conversation shifted, and soon Sarah was regaling us with another story about her latest project. But my husband didn't say a word for the rest of the meal. He picked at his food, his fork moving in precise mechanical motions. I told myself I was imagining things, that he was just tired or lost in thought. Still, a knot of unease settled in my stomach. On the way home, the silence was deafening. The city lights blurred past the windows, casting flickering shadows inside the car. I tried to fill the void with small talk. "Dinner was nice, wasn't it?" I said, forcing a cheerful tone. He grunted in response, his eyes fixed on the road. "Sarah's always got such wild stories. I can't believe she met that celebrity client." Another grunt, the knot in my stomach tightened. I bit my lip, debating whether to bring up the joke. Maybe he didn't even notice it. Maybe I was overthinking things, as I had a tendency to do. "You okay?" I finally asked, my voice softer. "Fine," he said curtly. I knew that tone. It was the kind of fine that meant anything but. We pulled into the driveway, the tires crunching against the gravel. The porch light flickered weakly, casting a dim glow over the front steps. He cut the engine and sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel. "I'm going to bed," he said without looking at me. And just like that, he was out of the car and up the steps, disappearing inside before I could even unbuckle my seatbelt. I sat there for a moment, stunned. The warmth of the evening had completely evaporated, leaving me chilled and unsettled. I replayed the dinner conversation in my head, searching for the exact moment things had gone wrong. Was it the joke? It couldn't be just that. People make jokes like that all the time. It was harmless, right? But deep down I knew better. I knew my husband, knew how sensitive he was about his job. And I had thrown him under the bus, however unintentionally. As I climbed the steps and entered the house, the weight of my mistake settled heavily on my shoulders. The air inside was thick with unspoken words, the kind that linger and fester. I wanted to go after him, to apologize or at least explain myself. But pride held me back. He's the one being dramatic, I told myself. It was just a joke. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, doubt crept in, insidious and unrelenting. What if this wasn't just about the joke? What if it was about everything I hadn't said, all the small cracks that had formed between us over time? I stood there in the dimly lit hallway, listening to the distant sound of water running upstairs. My heart ached with the weight of something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to fix it, but I didn't know how. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there in the dark, listening to the shallow rhythm of his breathing next to me. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, but there was a wall between us, one made of silence and hurt, thick and impenetrable. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face at dinner, that fleeting moment when he looked at me like I was a stranger, someone he couldn't quite trust. My mind kept circling back to the joke, gnawing at it like a dog with a bone. Was it really that bad? I asked myself over and over. I hadn't meant to humiliate him. If anything, I thought I was being playful, charming even. But now, in the stark clarity of the night, I could see how it might have sounded different to him, like I was diminishing his worth in front of our friends. The guilt gnawed at me, sharp and relentless. I wanted to reach out, to place my hand on his back and whisper an apology, but the weight of pride pressed me down. What if he brushed me off? What if I made things worse? By the time dawn broke, my thoughts were tangled in knots of resentment and regret. The faint light filtering through the curtains illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the walls. He stirred beside me, stretching before sitting up. "Morning," I said softly, testing the waters. "Morning," he replied, his voice flat. He didn't look at me as he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. I watched him cross the room, his shoulders tense, the lines of his back rigid with unspoken tension. "I'm making coffee," I offered, hoping for a flicker of connection. "Thanks," he said without turning around. It was like being invisible, and the sting of it cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I followed him downstairs, trying to act normal, as if we weren't standing on the precipice of something fragile and dangerous. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen, rich and familiar, but it did nothing to ease the ache in my chest. He stood by the window, staring out at the frost-covered lawn, his mug cradled in his hands. I wanted to say anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I busied myself with the mundane tasks of morning, pouring cereal, tidying up the counter. The clatter of dishes filled the silence, a poor substitute for the conversations we used to have. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Are we really going to do this?" I blurted out, my voice sharper than I intended. He turned to face me, his expression guarded. "Do what?" "This, the silent treatment, acting like strangers." "I'm not giving you the silent treatment," he said evenly. "Could have fooled me." He sighed, setting his mug down on the counter. "I just need some space, okay?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Space, the one thing I didn't want to give him. Space from what? Me? He hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. "You're being ridiculous," I said, my voice rising. "It was a joke, that's all." His jaw clenched. "It didn't feel like a joke." "Well, I'm sorry if you're so sensitive that you can't take a little teasing." The words were out before I could stop them, sharp and defensive. Regret bloomed in my chest the moment I saw the flicker of hurt in his eyes. "I guess that's the problem, isn't it?" he said quietly. "You think it's just about the joke. What's that supposed to mean?" He shook his head, his expression weary. "Forget it." "No, tell me," I demanded. "If this isn't about the joke, then what is it about?" He looked at me for a long moment, his gaze steady and unflinching. "It's about respect, or the lack of it." The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. "I respect you," I said, though the conviction in my voice wavered. "Do you?" He asked, his tone devoid of anger but filled with something far worse, disappointment. I opened my mouth to argue, but no words came out. Because deep down I knew he was right. It wasn't just the joke. It was the way I sometimes spoke to him, the subtle digs and dismissive comments, the way I tried to control the narrative of our relationship without even realizing it. Silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. "I need to get to work," he said finally, his voice heavy. And just like that, the conversation was over. He grabbed his coat and keys, leaving me standing there in the kitchen, my heart pounding and my thoughts in disarray. As the front door closed behind him, I felt the full weight of my actions settle over me. I had hurt him, not just with one careless joke, but with countless little moments that had chipped away at something precious between us. And now I wasn't sure if I knew how to fix it. The house was unbearably quiet after he left. I stood in the kitchen, my coffee growing cold on the counter, staring at the door as if willing him to come back. But of course he wouldn't, not now, not until whatever fragile thread that still connected us frayed even further. I sank onto one of the kitchen stools, my hands trembling slightly. The weight of the morning's conversation pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. His words echoed in my mind, each syllable cutting deeper than the last. "It's about respect, or the lack of it." Respect, that single word unraveled every defense I had built for myself. I thought about all the times I had made light of his worries, brushed off his concerns as overreactions, or played the role of the charming, witty wife at his expense. At the time I told myself it was harmless, but maybe it hadn't been, not to him. A wave of shame washed over me, hot and suffocating. I had always prided myself on being perceptive, on understanding people and situations with razor-sharp clarity. But somehow I had completely missed what was happening in my own marriage. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over his name in the call list. The urge to fix this, to say something that would make it all go away, was overwhelming. But what would I even say? "Hey, sorry for systematically chipping away at your self-esteem. Want to grab lunch?" No, that wasn't how this worked. I set the phone down with a frustrated sigh. Apologizing wasn't my strong suit, especially when I wasn't entirely sure how much blame I deserved. Part of me still clung to the belief that he was overreacting. I hadn't meant to hurt him. Surely that counted for something, didn't it? But intentions didn't always matter. Impact did. And the impact of my words was etched across his face this morning, in the tired slump of his shoulders and the quiet resignation in his voice. I forced myself to get up, to move. Sitting in the suffocating silence of our kitchen wasn't going to help anything. I cleaned up the remnants of breakfast, the clinking of dishes, a poor substitute for the conversation we should have been having. By the time the kitchen was spotless, I still didn't feel any better. If anything, the gleaming counters and neatly stacked plates only highlighted the chaos swirling inside me. I wandered into the living room, my eyes landing on the framed photos lining the mantel. There we were, frozen in time, smiling at our wedding, laughing on vacation, holding hands at some forgotten event. The people in those photos looked happy, sure of each other in a way that now felt distant and foreign. I wondered when that certainty had begun to slip through our fingers. Was it gradual, like sand slipping through a sieve, or had it shattered all at once, unnoticed until it was too late? I ran my finger along the edge of one frame, the cold metal biting against my skin. The memory behind the photo flickered in my mind, our honeymoon, standing on a sunlit beach with the waves crashing behind us. His arm was around my waist, pulling me close, his laughter infectious as I tried to keep my hair from flying into my face. I had never felt safer or more loved than I did in that moment. The ache in my chest deepened. I wanted that version of us back, the one where laughter was effortless and love was uncomplicated. But wanting something didn't make it real, and the distance between who we were and who we had become felt vast and unbridgeable. The front door creaked open, startling me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt, foolishly hopeful that it was him. It was. "Hey," Sarah's voice echoed through the entryway as she let herself in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by. I plastered on a smile as she entered the living room, her sharp eyes immediately picking up on the tension in my posture. "You okay?" she asked, dropping her bag onto the couch. "Yeah, just a rough morning," I said, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Rough morning or rough husband?" I sighed, sinking onto the couch. "Both." She sat beside me, her expression softening. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated. Sarah was one of my closest friends, but she was also quick to form opinions, and I wasn't sure I wanted to hear her take on my marriage right now. Still, the need to unload was stronger than my reluctance. "I made a joke at dinner last night," I admitted, "about his salary, and he's been distant ever since." Sarah winced. "Oof, yeah, that's a tricky one." I frowned. "It wasn't that bad, I didn't say anything cruel, it was just a joke." "Sure," she said carefully, "but you know guys and their egos, money's a touchy subject." "I didn't mean anything by it," I insisted. "He's the one blowing it out of proportion." "Maybe," Sarah said, her tone diplomatic. "But have you tried just apologizing?" The word hung in the air between us, heavy and uninviting. "I don't know what I'd even be apologizing for," I said defensively. Sarah gave me a pointed look. "You don't have to mean harm to cause it." Her words landed with uncomfortable precision, cutting through my defenses. "I hate when you're right," I muttered. She grinned. "It's a curse." As she left a short while later, I was left with the echo of her words and the gnawing realization that maybe the first step toward fixing this was admitting I'd messed up. But knowing that and actually doing it were two very different things. And I wasn't sure I was ready for either. The day dragged on, heavy and relentless. I cleaned the house twice, reorganized the pantry, and even considered baking something just to keep my hands busy. But none of it helped. My thoughts kept circling back to the conversation with my husband and Sarah's frustratingly wise suggestion. Just apologize. As if it were that simple. Apologies had never come easily to me. They felt like an admission of failure, a surrender I wasn't sure I knew how to make. By mid-afternoon, the house was immaculate, and I was no closer to figuring out what to do. The weight of the unresolved tension pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I sat on the couch, my knees tucked under me, scrolling mindlessly through my phone. Social media was filled with people who seemed to have their lives perfectly together, vacation photos, happy couples, promotions, and smiling kids. It was a curated fantasy, but today it cut deeper than usual. I tossed the phone onto the cushion beside me, staring blankly at the ceiling. The walls of the house felt like they were closing in, suffocating me with their silence. I needed air. Grabbing my coat, I stepped outside, the crisp winter air biting against my skin. The neighborhood was quiet, the trees bare and stark against the pale gray sky. I walked aimlessly, my breath forming clouds in the chilly air. The rhythm of my footsteps on the pavement was steady, grounding. For a while, I just focused on the sensation of moving, letting the cold numb my swirling thoughts. Eventually, I found myself at the small park near our house. It was mostly empty, save for a mother pushing her toddler on a swing and an older man walking his dog. I sat on a bench, my hands stuffed into my pockets, watching the branches sway in the wind. Memories of countless walks with my husband flooded back, the easy conversations, the laughter, the way he used to reach for my hand without thinking. We hadn't done that in a long time. A lump formed in my throat and I swallowed hard, fighting back the tears threatening to spill. I hated feeling this way, vulnerable, unsure, desperate. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me out of my thoughts. I pulled it out, my heart leaping when I saw his name on the screen. I hesitated for a split second before answering. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "Hey," he replied. His tone was cautious, guarded. There was a long pause, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. "I'm gonna be late tonight," he said finally. "Got some stuff to finish up at work." "Oh," I said, the disappointment sharp and immediate. "Okay. I just wanted to let you know," he added as if that made it better. "Thanks for telling me," I managed, though my voice wavered. Another pause. I could hear the faint hum of office noises in the background, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, voices murmuring. Look, I said suddenly, the words tumbling out before I could stop them, about this morning. Let's not do this over the phone, he interrupted gently. I bit my lip, torn between relief and frustration. Okay, I agreed reluctantly. I'll see you later, he said. Yeah, later. The call ended, leaving me staring at the screen, the ache in my chest intensifying. I wanted to fix things, but every step forward felt like walking on thin ice, uncertain and treacherous. As I walked back home, the cold seeping into my bones, I kept replaying his voice in my head. There was something distant about it, as though he'd built a wall around himself that I wasn't sure I could break through. By the time I reached the house, the sky had darkened and a bitter wind swept through the streets. I stood on the porch for a moment, reluctant to go back inside. When I finally did, the warmth of the house felt hollow, as if it were merely a facade. I hung up my coat and wandered into the living room, my eyes landing on the same photos I'd stared at earlier. This time they felt like a challenge, a reminder of what we'd once had and what I was terrified of losing. I sat down on the couch, the weight of exhaustion settling over me. Apologies weren't just about admitting you were wrong. They were about being vulnerable, about putting your heart on the line and hoping the other person would catch it instead of letting it shatter on the floor. I didn't know if I had that kind of courage, but if I didn't try, I risked losing everything. The thought was unbearable, so I sat there rehearsing words I wasn't even sure I could say, my heart caught between hope and fear. The hours crept by in agonizing slow motion. The house was eerily still, the kind of silence that magnified every creak and sigh of the walls. I tried to distract myself, watched half an episode of a show I couldn't follow, flipped through a magazine without reading a single word, even paced the living room until the floorboards protested under my restless steps. But nothing could drown out the relentless beat of my thoughts. I kept glancing at the clock, my stomach twisting with every passing minute. He was usually home by now, even when he said he'd be late. 1,000 irrational scenarios flooded my mind, each more catastrophic than the last. What if he was hurt? What if this was his way of distancing himself permanently, of testing out a life without me? I shook my head, trying to banish the thoughts. I was spiraling and I knew it, but knowing didn't make it stop. The sound of the front door opening jolted me out of my spiral. My heart leaped into my throat as I sprang to my feet, nerves jangling like live wires. He stepped inside, shaking off the cold and unwinding his scarf. His face was drawn, weariness etched into every line. Our eyes met briefly before he looked away, closing the door with a quiet click. You're back, I said, my voice catching. Yeah, he replied, his tone neutral. He hung up his coat with meticulous care, as though delaying the inevitable conversation waiting between us. I hovered awkwardly near the couch, unsure whether to approach him or give him space. Dinner in the fridge if you're hungry, I offered, my voice brittle. Thanks, he said, though he didn't move toward the kitchen. The air between us was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on us. I couldn't take it anymore. We need to talk, I said, the words trembling on my lips. He sighed, turning to face me. Yeah, we do. I gestured toward the couch. Sit. He hesitated for a moment before nodding and crossing the room. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the distance between us palpable. I twisted my hands in my lap, searching for the right words. But there were no perfect words, no magic phrase that could undo the damage I'd done. I'm sorry, I blurted out, the sincerity raw and unfiltered. For the joke, for all of it. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. Why now? What do you mean? You've made comments like that before, he said quietly. Why is this time different? I swallowed hard, guilt clawing at my throat. Because I saw how much it hurt you, and I guess I didn't realize until now how often I do that. He nodded slowly, as if processing my words. It's not just the joke, it's the pattern. I know, I admitted, my voice cracking. I didn't mean to, but you did, he interrupted gently. And I let it slide for a long time because I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but last night, it just hit differently. I'm so sorry, I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. I never wanted to make you feel less than. I was trying to be funny, but I crossed a line. I see that now. His gaze softened, though the hurt lingered in his eyes. I believe you, but it's going to take time for me to shake this off. I'll do better, I promised. I'll be more mindful, he sighed, leaning back against the couch. I'm not perfect either. I should have spoken up sooner instead of bottling it up. We sat in heavy silence, the weight of vulnerability settling over us. It wasn't a neat resolution, but it was a start, a fragile, tentative step toward something better. I missed you today, I admitted softly. His lips curved into a faint, weary smile. I missed you too. Relief washed over me, though I knew we weren't out of the woods yet. There was still work to be done, wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of hope, and that was enough to hold on to for now. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled and restless. Beside me, he slept quietly, his breathing steady and measured. The space between us in bed felt both physical and symbolic, a chasm carved by words I couldn't take back. I wanted to close the gap, to reach for his hand or nestle against his warmth like I used to. But something held me back, the lingering uncertainty, the fragile truce we'd barely managed to establish. My mind replayed the past few days on an endless loop, analyzing every moment, every word, every silence. How had we gotten here? When did my humor, once a source of connection, become a weapon I wielded without realizing it? I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the guilt to subside. But guilt was persistent, clinging to the edges of my consciousness like a shadow that refused to be shaken. Eventually, I gave up on sleep and slipped quietly out of bed. The cold floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the living room. The darkness was thick and enveloping, broken only by the soft glow of the street lamp filtering through the window. I curled up on the couch, pulling a blanket over my shoulders and stared into the void. The quiet was oppressive, amplifying the turmoil inside me. I thought about what Sarah had said earlier. You don't have to mean harm to cause it. She was right, of course. I hated how right she was. My words had always been my armor, a way to deflect vulnerability and maintain control. But somewhere along the way, I'd forgotten that words could cut just as deeply as they could connect. I reached for my phone, scrolling aimlessly through old photos. There we were at the beach, laughing under a blazing sun. At a dinner party, his arm draped casually over my shoulders. At home on a lazy Sunday, tangled up on the couch with messy hair and contented smiles. The versions of us in those photos seemed distant, almost like strangers. Tears pricked my eyes, and I swiped at them angrily. I hated crying. It felt weak, indulgent. But tonight there was no stopping it. The dam broke and the tears came in waves, raw and unrelenting. I cried for the love I was terrified of losing, for the woman I didn't want to be, for the man who deserved better than what I'd given him. When the tears finally subsided, I was left hollow and exhausted. But there was a strange clarity in that emptiness, a quiet resolve forming in the aftermath. Couldn't change the past, but I could try to be better, more thoughtful, more aware, more careful with the words I chose. It wouldn't be easy. Habits were hard to break, and self-awareness was a double-edged sword, but if I wanted to keep what mattered most, I had to try. The soft creak of the floorboards startled me. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair mussed from sleep, concern etched across his face. "You okay?" he asked quietly. I nodded, wiping at my face. "Yeah, couldn't sleep." He crossed the room, sitting down beside me. "Nightmare?" "No," I admitted, "just thinking too much." He glanced at me, his gaze steady and searching. "Want to talk about it?" I hesitated, the vulnerability still raw and uncomfortable. But if we were going to move forward, I had to be honest, even when it hurt. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began carefully. "About respect and how I've made you feel." He listened silently, his expression unreadable. "I didn't realize how much my words were hurting you," I continued. "I was so caught up in being funny or clever that I forgot to be kind, and I hate that I made you feel small." He exhaled slowly. "It's not just about the words, it's about feeling seen and valued, and sometimes, I didn't feel that with you." His honesty hit me like a punch to the gut, but I knew he wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just telling the truth, something I'd asked for but wasn't fully prepared to hear. "I want to do better," I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "I know it's going to take time, but I'm willing to put in the work if you are." He nodded, his expression softening. "Me too." We sat there in the quiet, the weight of our conversation hanging in the air. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step, a fragile, tentative step toward healing. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. I held onto him tightly, as though anchoring myself to this moment, this promise of something better. And for the first time in days, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to be okay. A week later, we found ourselves at Sarah and Daniel's house for dinner. It was the first social outing we'd agreed to since everything had happened, and I was nervous. Not about seeing Sarah, she'd been a constant support, but about being around other people. The wounds between us were still tender, and I was terrified of slipping back into bad habits in front of an audience. "You sure you're up for this?" I asked him quietly as we stood on the doorstep. He gave a small nod. "Yeah, we need this." The door swung open and Sarah greeted us with her usual warmth. "There they are," she beamed, pulling me into a tight hug. Come in, come in. You're just in time." Daniel's trying not to burn the stakes. Her lightheartedness eased some of the tension coiled in my chest. We followed her inside, the savory aroma of grilled food wafting through the air. Daniel was indeed hovering near the grill, a look of intense concentration on his face. "Hey," he called out, waving a pair of tongs in greeting. "Long time no see. Looks like you're in your element," my husband joked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Daniel laughed, trying to impress as usual. We settled into the easy rhythm of dinner preparations, the atmosphere light and convivial. Sarah poured wine, Daniel regaled us with a story about a disastrous camping trip, and for a while it felt like everything was normal. But as we sat down to eat, the conversation took an unexpected turn. "So," Sarah began, her tone teasing, "are you two still making those hilarious jabs at each other? I swear you were the comedy act of our last get-together." I froze, the words hitting me like a slap. My stomach knotted and I felt my face heat with embarrassment. My husband's expression was unreadable, but I saw the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "No comedy acts tonight," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just a quiet dinner with friends." Sarah's brow furrowed slightly, sensing the shift in mood. Ah, got it. Well, quiet works too. The conversation moved on, but my nerves were shot. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and it took everything in me not to spiral into guilt and self-recrimination. After dinner, Sarah pulled me aside while the guys cleaned up. Hey, she said gently, everything okay? I hesitated, torn between brushing it off and confiding in her. It's been complicated, I admitted. We've been working through some stuff, she nodded thoughtfully. Relationships are messy, but you're strong, you'll get through it. Thanks, I said, grateful for her support. As we left later that night, the cool air wrapping around us, I stole a glance at him. You okay? He nodded slowly. It wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Sarah didn't mean anything by it, I said softly. I know, he replied, but it reminded me of, well, everything. I'm sorry, I said for what felt like the 100th time. I hate that I put us in this place. He stopped walking and turned to face me. We're not stuck here, he said firmly. We're moving forward, right? I swallowed hard, emotion tightening my throat. Right. We walked the rest of the way to the car in companionable silence, the night sky stretching endlessly above us. It wasn't perfect. There were still rough edges and lingering wounds, but there was also progress, however small, and for now, that was enough. The next few days felt like a blur. I threw myself into work, into everything that kept me busy and distracted. But no matter how hard I tried to focus on the tasks in front of me, my mind always circled back to him, his distant looks, the quiet moments between us. I could tell he was trying to, but there was an underlying tension that neither of us seemed able to shake. We were like two people swimming in different currents, both fighting the same battle but unable to meet in the middle. One evening after dinner, I suggested we go for a walk. He agreed with little more than a grunt, and we stepped outside into the cool night air. It wasn't the romantic stroll I'd hoped for, but it was a step toward something. We walked side by side, the distance between us still tangible, though neither of us spoke about it. Finally, after what felt like hours of silence, I broke it. Do you think we'll be okay? He stopped walking, his hand running through his hair as he looked out at the street. I don't know, I really don't. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I know I hurt you, and I can't take that back. I know, he said, his voice low, but it's not just that, it's everything, I guess. I don't know if I can keep feeling like I'm constantly on the defensive. My heart sank, and I felt a sharp pang of fear twist in my chest. What do you mean? I mean that I've been guarding myself for so long, waiting for the next jab, the next moment where I have to laugh it off or brush it aside. He exhaled sharply, his frustration seeping through. Can't live like that, feeling like I'm constantly not enough. I stepped closer, my breath catching. You are enough, you always have been. I know, he interrupted softly. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, but sometimes it feels like you don't see me. His words hit me harder than any joke I'd ever made. I hadn't seen him, not really, not in the way that mattered. I see you, I whispered, my voice cracking. I do, I'm so sorry, I wish I could go back, take everything back. He looked at me, his expression softening. You can't go back, neither of us can, but we can start from here, from now. I nodded, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I want to fix this. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the faintest glimmer of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was something. We continued walking, but this time there was less space between us, a slight shift that made all the difference. Later that night, as we sat on the couch together, I realized something I hadn't fully grasped before. We weren't broken. We were just two people who had lost sight of each other for a while, and now we were finding our way back. It wasn't going to be easy. We both had our flaws, our scars, our insecurities. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the struggle wasn't something to avoid, but something to grow through. I leaned into him, my head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around me, and we sat in the quiet, neither of us needing to say anything more. We had a long road ahead of us. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were heading in the right direction, and that was enough. A few days passed, and things felt steadier. The silence between us had softened, replaced by tentative conversations, small touches, and quiet moments where we simply existed together. It wasn't perfect, but there was something reassuring in the calm after the storm. I found myself starting to relax again, to not second-guess every word that left my mouth, to laugh without the immediate worry that it might land the wrong way. But even in this new peace, there was still the undercurrent of everything that had happened. The past, with all its sharp edges, hovered just out of sight, waiting to resurface at the slightest nudge. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. I had been meaning to text Sarah to thank her for being there for me, but the words felt harder to form than usual. My thoughts kept drifting back to him, the way he still seemed a little guarded, the way he would sometimes pull away in a room full of people, like he was trying to shield himself from something. I hated that I had put that wall up between us. It was then that he walked into the room, looking tired but calm. He stopped when he saw me, his gaze softening. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice gentle. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I was ready to voice the quiet fear that had been gnawing at me. I don't know if we're really okay. I feel like we're both just trying to hold it together, but He sat down across from me, his eyes steady on mine. You're afraid that this is just temporary. That I'll slip back into being distant and you'll go back to joking your way through everything. I nodded, the truth of it hanging in the air between us. Yeah, I guess I am. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't know if things will ever be exactly how they were before. Maybe that's a good thing, maybe not. But I'm trying to be more honest with you, with myself. I felt my chest tighten, my emotions rising to the surface. I don't want you to ever feel like you're not enough again. Like I don't see you. You do see me, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And I see you too. I guess we both have a lot to work through, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it. His words settled into my chest, and for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something like hope, raw, fragile, but real. I'm scared, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Scared that we'll never be able to undo all the damage. He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. I'm scared too. But I don't think we're beyond repair. We just have to keep showing up for each other, that's all. There was a weight to his words, a truth I could feel deep in my bones. I squeezed his hand, the tension between us finally starting to ease. I'm sorry, I whispered, the words feeling heavy on my tongue. I don't want to hurt you anymore. He smiled softly, the edges of his lips curling up just enough to remind me of the man I'd fallen in love with. I know, and I'm sorry too. We sat there for a while, neither of us needing to fill the silence with anything else. There was comfort in the quiet, a sense of shared understanding that we had come to the same conclusion, that we weren't perfect, but we were worth the effort. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside him, I found myself reflecting on everything that had brought us here. The missteps, the hurt, the long nights spent wondering if we'd ever make it through. But there was something about the way we were holding each other now, the quiet promises in our touch, that made me think we might just find our way back to each other after all. We weren't there yet. There was still so much to unpack, so many wounds to heal. But the possibility felt real. And maybe that was all we needed to keep going. A few days later, we found ourselves on the cusp of a new chapter, one we both knew we weren't fully ready for but were too far in to back out of. I could feel the shift, small and subtle but significant. It was in the way we spoke to each other, the slight glances we exchanged when something unsaid hung in the air. I had noticed that we were finally not letting the distance between us grow, even when it felt like it was inevitable. We had stopped walking on eggshells, but there was still the underlying question of whether we could really repair what had been broken. It was a Saturday afternoon when I got home after a long day at work, tired and feeling emotionally drained from the hours of pretending I had it all together. As I stepped through the door, I found him sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the TV but not really watching. He was hunched forward, his posture tense, and for a moment I thought about how strange it felt to see him so still, as though the world was moving around him but he couldn't find the energy to engage. I hesitated at the threshold of the room, watching him for a few seconds longer before I entered. My mind immediately began to race, full of all the things we hadn't yet talked about, all the things I wasn't sure we ever would, but I knew I had to try again. This time I wasn't going to skirt around the uncomfortable moments. I had to open up, really open up, and trust that he was ready to listen. Hey, I said softly, crossing the room to stand in front of him. How was your day? He blinked and looked up at me almost as if he had forgotten I was there. Oh, it was fine, he replied, his voice distant. Busy, same old stuff. His words didn't match the tenseness in his posture, the faraway look in his eyes. Something was off, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You sure? I asked, my tone a little more insistent. You seem... I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. He shrugged, glancing down at his hands, which were tightly gripping the edges of the couch cushion. I'm just tired, he muttered, clearly avoiding eye contact. I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. I sat down beside him on the couch, closer than I had in days. You know, I've been thinking about what you said the other night, about feeling like I don't really see you. He didn't respond right away, and I took that as a sign to continue, my words coming more quickly now. I know I've been distracted. I've been so wrapped up in my own insecurities and everything else that I haven't really been paying attention to you. I'm sorry. There was a beat of silence and I could feel his hesitation, but I refused to pull away. If there was any chance of mending the broken pieces of us, I had to keep pushing, even if it was uncomfortable. I know I've made jokes about things that shouldn't have been jokes, I continued, my voice steady but laced with the vulnerability I had been carrying for weeks. I thought I could make light of it, but all I've really done is made you feel small. His jaw clenched and I immediately regretted the words. I didn't mean to, I said quickly, my hand reaching for his. I never wanted to make you feel like that. He exhaled slowly, his breath heavy with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. After a long pause, he finally spoke. It's not just the jokes though, he said quietly. It's the fact that every time you made a joke, it was like you were pushing me further away. My heart twisted and I tried to wrap my mind around what he was saying. What do you mean? He turned to face me fully now, his eyes meeting mine for the first time in days. You would joke about my job, about my salary, about the things I couldn't give you. And every time you did that, it felt like you were telling me I wasn't good enough, that I didn't measure up. I blinked, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. I didn't mean it like that, I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. I know you didn't, he said, his voice softer now. But that's how it felt. And after a while, it stopped feeling like something I could laugh off. I sat there, staring at him, speechless for a moment. I hadn't realized how much my words had cut him, how careless I had been in trying to hide my own anxieties behind humor. And the worst part was that I had been so consumed with my own hurt, my own need for validation, that I hadn't stopped to consider how it affected him. I'm sorry, I said again, my voice cracking. I didn't realize what I was doing to you. I thought if I made a joke, it would just be funny. I didn't see that it was tearing us apart. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of all the things he had been carrying that I hadn't known about. It's okay, he said quietly. I know you didn't do it on purpose. We sat in silence for a moment, the air between us heavy with everything we had finally acknowledged. I just don't want to keep hurting you, I said, my voice barely audible. You're not hurting me now, he replied, his tone gentle. But we have to keep being honest with each other. If we don't, it'll only get worse. I promise, I said, my heart swelling with both guilt and relief. I'll do better. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we could begin to rebuild what had been broken. Thank you for reading. Sometimes, the hardest part of any relationship is finding the courage to be vulnerable and honest with the ones we love. Healing isn't linear, but the effort to understand one another is what ultimately brings us closer. If you found yourself resonating with this journey, know that you're not alone. The road ahead might be difficult, but it's always worth it when we're willing to work through the tough parts together.